we were looking at each other going, what is going on? Like, Lord, please do not let this continue. There's no way we're ready for Double Kingdom Impact in 2 years. That if you're actually going to pray and believe that the Lord's going to bring this growth and this impact, that you actually start planning for it physically.
Well, hey everyone, welcome to the Intentional Churches podcast. My name is Erin Johnston. Great to be with you all again. I'm here with, as usual, my good friend Doug Parks. What's up, Doug?
Hey, Erin. Going
well.
well.
With you.
You
all
too.
Right. Yes. And have a new friend with us today, Jeremy Thiessen, who Doug just found out he's been saying his name wrong for 3 years. He's been calling him Jeremy Thiessen. But Jeremy, that's not your name. Your name is Jeremy Thiessen.
It is, and my kids would correct you in a heartbeat. I'm significantly more generous and will let it fly, but just don't mispronounce it in front of my kids.
I'm doing it on purpose now. I can't wait to meet them.
That's awesome. Well, Jeremy, why don't you tell us who you are, a little bit about you, what you do, and then we'll jump into our conversation from there.
Yeah, awesome. I'm in Modesto, California, Northern California, about an hour and a half south of Sacramento. I've been here in the executive pastor seat. Well, been at the church for 10 years, in the XP seat for about 5. Prior to that, I was in Nashville, Tennessee, in the Christian music industry. So California and church is the total logical next step coming out of that. But born and raised in northern British Columbia, Canada, and so we've been on a crazy journey. 4 kids, ages 15 to 8, and they keep our life hopping. I'm a significantly underpaid Uber driver in this season.
Nice.
Do they at least give you 5-star reviews every time you drop them where they need to be?
Well, if they want ice cream at the end of the night, absolutely.
Yeah, that's right.
And then one last question, Jeremy. Who's your kid's favorite hockey team since you're Canadian?
Oh, man, we're a little bit of a house divided. Most of us are Preds fans from our years in Nashville, but I've got one outlier who's a Vegas Kings fan. Kings, Knights, Vegas Knights.
Yes, Vegas Knights.
Sorry. Yeah. Hey, little side note, though, I have yet to get tickets to a Knights game from Doug. I just want to go public with that, and hopefully that'll...
Come on, Doug.
I tried. I only have one friend that has season tickets, and he uses them. So
maybe Erin can pull some strings. We'll see what happens. But
I have no ends with that, Jeremy. But yeah. Well, in season 4 of this podcast, what we've really been trying to do is trying to think about the next push, the next season of ministry. Any one of our listeners that's been in ministry for any amount of time knows that we're often experiencing one thing, but we're always kind of prepping for the next thing, right? And ministry kind of comes in waves. And so we kind of prep for these different pushes, these different like concentrated efforts throughout the year. And so that's what this season is all about. And one of the big concerns for many, many, many churches is the idea of physical space. So as we're thinking about kind of the next season of ministry, the next push in ministry, one of the things we have to think about is our physical space, our facilities. Do we have enough space? How are we going to think well about that? All those things are things to consider. Before we talk about the physical space component, Jeremy, I think it'd be good for you to just kind of help us into the journey your church has been on. You're at a church called Shelter Cove, right?
Yep.
Did we get that name right? Okay,
yeah,
so we're
did.
1 for 2 on names. Perfect. 50%.
Wow.
Why don't you just give us an overview of the last few years of your church's journey? What's been happening? Just try to kind of help our listeners just give some context there.
Yeah, so the church is 23 years old. We have our second lead pastor. He's been in that role about 11 years. Prior to that, he was the youth pastor, so he's been with the church for about 19. Our kind of founding pastor was a phenomenal Bible teacher. He taught the word. In fact, the church started as a 800-person Bible study. Like people came to hear this gifted teacher teach. Yeah. But it was a very inward-focused, 99-focused church. people would drive by all the time, and we would hear stories years later, be like, I drove by your church every day and didn't know that was a church. So our community did not know that we existed. If you were a 99er, right? If you were a believer, you knew there was a radio ministry and all of that. But our lost friends and family out there didn't know we were here. Our lead guy came on board, had a huge, our new guy, had huge heart for the lost, and really started leading us down for a season, a very attractional model, just to kind of say, hey, we're out here. Come see us. Come get to know us. We're for you. So we did all the things. We did the helicopter Easter egg drops. We did the giant snow hills in at wintertime. We did the drive-through Christmas light shows. We got really good at drawing a crowd to our campus. It would 8,000 plus kind of people come through campus on an afternoon. So there were lots of pros to that, but we weren't really seeing the needle move on just general growth perspective, or it was really hard to tie those big events to life transformation, life change. There'd be the periodic story, but nothing of substance. And so right around this time, then we engaged with Church OS and intentional churches. And so call it January of 2022, we did our 2-day install with Church OS. And I'm sure your listeners at this point are familiar with the idea, right? Double kingdom impact in X number of years.
Hey, Jeremy, some of them aren't. So just real quick, for our listeners, I wanted to define, you used the phrase 99 and 1. And for those listeners who aren't familiar with Church OS or essential churches, just that language, what it means, we lean into Luke 15 and talk about the 99 being kind of your congregation, those are with you, and the 1 being those in the relational networks of your people who don't know Jesus yet. So thanks. Sorry to interrupt you there, but yeah.
No. Yeah, good clarification. So our journey with intentional churches started. And generally, we try and aim for a 5-year double kingdom impact in 5 years. My lead pastor is an overachiever. He likes to push the limit, and so he was like, we can do it in 4. So our goal was to double our weekend attendance in 4 years, which at that point, that snapshot in January of 2022 was 1,300. So fast forward 2 years this January. So we're right at the 2-year mark of our journey. We had 3 consecutive weeks in January of all months. Nothing special going on other than people restarting their year kind of thing, where we had between 2,800 and 3,000 people on campus.
Wow.
And we were looking at each other going, what is going on? Like, this is... Lord, please do not let this continue. There's no way we're ready for double kingdom impact in 2 years. So it really kind of prompted a little bit of a panic in me going, okay, I'm behind the curveball here, and we got to move quick. If this holds. Now, it hasn't. We've leveled out for the year around 2,400, but it's still significant growth even from where we were at in November. And so one of the things for me has been, briefly, I will say, hey, I wish somebody would have told me at the start of this journey that if you're actually going to pray and believe that the Lord's going to bring this growth and this impact, that you actually start planning for it physically. So that's been my journey. Now, it's one. Well, we'll get into the rest of that, but that was a key learning for me in this journey was I should have started thinking about this, planning for this as an actual reality, as opposed to just a dream earlier.
Sure. So what I hear you saying is you've added at least 1,000 people, if not more, to your weekends within the last couple of years. And that's creating some space challenges, which we'll get into here in just a minute. Doug, why don't you speak to this for just a minute? like at the national level? That's kind of the contribution you bring to the podcast is, what are you seeing nationally? Are you seeing many stories that are similar to Jeremy's of growth and struggling with physical space? Like just speak to that for a minute for us.
Well, thanks, Erin and Jeremy. Awesome, man. Just it's so encouraging to hear what's going on there. I would say I'm going to give a caveat first, and that is there are still trends of plateaued and dying churches in America, and there's a substantial number. I heard a stat this week that was I think 60% are in decline or on their way to death of the church. 300,000. Well, the 300,000 number of evangelical churches in America was pre-COVID, so we don't even know what the real number is now. So to those of you who are in a church like that, this is not meant to shame or embarrass or anything like that. Hopefully it stirs something in you of the vision cast of what could be true if you really mobilize and activate your people, not chasing silver bullets, not just doing these big crowd drawing events, but really mobilizing and activating your people. I think we've said this before on the podcast, Erin. So we noticed a trend when we were with church teams back in 2021, and that was that a lot of new families were showing up at churches across the country. Didn't matter the denom, didn't matter if it was rural, urban, a lot of new families. Now, attendance patterns for services were still lower for most churches than 2019. That trend continued through 22, and really Q4 of 22 really hockey sticked. And we've seen a trend in a lot of churches, again, the caveat being where people are owning the Great Commission as a personal mission statement more and more, of record baptisms, and in a lot of places, attendance in weekend services that's higher than records, and especially in 2019. And I've gotten to the point where it almost feels like there's this intersecting thing going on of almost the word revival. A friend of mine told me that for revival to be true, two things must happen. Number one, there has to be a spiritual awakening and curiosity in those who don't know Jesus yet. And number two, the church must repent. And so I think what you're hearing in Jeremy and many churches is this, I don't know that I would use that strong word for Shelter Cove, but this, hey, we're going to turn away from chasing these very attractionally based things and really work a lot more in how we're mobilizing and activating our people to own the mission. And then the byproduct of that is what Jeremy's experiencing, which we're finding across the country. Record numbers of generosity initiatives, building campaigns happening. And it's a time that is very important to be having this conversation where when a church goes to spend money on facility, it's the most amount of money they'll spend at any time in their history. And we really, in intentional churches, we teach a lean facility planning model. And then you have the first piece that has to happen when you're dealing into this issue, this challenge of having more people than will fit, that you consider other services or maybe multi-site. I mean, we're going to get into these strategies, but the natural trend, I would say, there's a large chunk of churches facing the very thing Jeremy's talking about, where we're running out of space in a weekend service at the prime inviting hours from 10 to 11 on Sunday morning. We're running out of parking, seats, and kid space. And so we got to go solve that, because here's the thing. If you don't, what you're subconsciously telling your church people is stop inviting.
Exactly.
There's not room for your friends who don't know Jesus at this church. So,
yeah, that's really helpful, Doug. Thank you. Jeremy, why don't you kind of walk us now with some of this context to stand on? Walk us into what are the space things that you are trying to solve right now? And then we'll have kind of a discussion around that for our listeners.
Yeah, good question. So, and Doug kind of nailed it, right? So for us, it's worship center, kids space, parking. We're okay with, kind of borderline, but worship center and kids space. Our worship center seats 620. So, the feel full rate of 80% during we were running 4 services on a weekend, 6 p.m. on Saturday, 8:30, 10, and 11:30 Sunday morning. We got into the kind of this dilemma early this year, and we're going, man, that's the first thing we can do is add another service time, right? That'll hopefully help alleviate some of the pressure. But the only space was at 4:30 on Saturday night. So we added a second Saturday night service and started pushing our people to that, which actually was interesting. That time was more appealing to the young families in the bunch because they could actually do church first and then have dinner and get their kids into bed. That kind of made sense after the fact, but surprised us initially. But still, the 10 and 11:30 services, our usher team has gotten really great. We're probably loading that at between 90 and 93% capacity. But the tension, to Doug's point, is how can we stand up on stage and cast a vision of go out and invite your 99 or your lost friend, your one, right? Bring them to church when they're looking around going, well, where am I going to put them? There's not going to be there's not a seat in here for them. So why would I do that? So, and we're not going to add 6 and 7 more services, right? So the tension we're in now is, okay, we got to start a capital campaign. We got to get a new worship center built. We're in California. Everything's crazy expensive in California. How much debt do we want to take on as a church for the next X number of years? Will our staff be standing on 2 feet if it takes us 3 years to get this built, right?
Oh, it's so real.
So all of that stuff is right front and center right now.
Yeah. So I'm curious, how are you? I'm sure for many of our listeners, they relate. Like even as you're talking, I'm like twitching because we have some of this going on ourselves. How are you using this conversation to kind of align, like to bring alignment, to like refresh the vision for your staff, your leadership teams, whatever that looks like, your board, your congregation, any of those things? How are you using this moment of, okay, guys, we clearly have an issue with space, right? We're not going to have 100,000 services on the weekends. How are you using this moment to like align people in the direction of who you're trying to become and get everybody on the same page?
Well, I think there's a lot of conversations, partially just around celebrating. Like we're 2 years in, and I would say one of the main reasons why we're experiencing this growth is because our people are catching the vision. They're making it their own. It's anecdotal, but every weekend we're being introduced to people's ones. They're celebrating. So hey, my one is here. Or, hey, my one just went up to get baptized this weekend. Like those are stories that as your church grows, you got to share them because not everybody's going to be around and hear those every week, right? So we're doing a lot of celebrating around the vision being carried by our people versus our staff. I think one of the things on a staffing end, we've really leaned into Ephesians 4, equipping the saints for the work of the ministry, right? I was just crunching some numbers this morning, and we're sitting around 92 to 1 congregant to staff ratio, which I included kids in that. I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but which is a high ratio, which I'm grateful for because we have leaned into like equipping and empowering volunteers to lead and develop other people, and that's been big for us. Those big events, helped us kind of bring some of those volunteers and that volunteer culture to the surface. But honestly, in the last year, we've moved significantly away from the big, we call them bonfire events. That's actually, I think, Drew language back in the day, bonfire and wildfire. But we've moved away from those events because our people are doing it. They've captured it. They're talking, having those conversations, and So it's been exciting. Our board's on board. They're living it out. And we just keep coming back to, in the regular conversations, the regular rhythms, going, hey, how are the one conversations going in your life? Who are your ones? Talk about it. How can we be praying for them? Making that a personal thing, not an institutional, you're on the team, you have to do this kind of a thing.
I think you hit on something earlier that's important, which is, even if you're going to build a building right now, even if you're going to start that like today, it's going to be 2 or 3 years before you're in the building.
Yeah.
And so for many of our listeners who are either going to build and create more physical space, or maybe there's some that don't even have that option right now, financially or otherwise, how are we going to think creatively about this? Like, how are we going to solve space issues creatively? Have you guys spent any time thinking about what are we going to do between now and then? You already talked about adding services and said, we're not going to keep adding service after service. Are there other things you guys are thinking about in terms of how to address some of these space concerns in the interim?
Yeah, and I'm open to suggestions. But some of the things we have talked about and are implementing or preparing for would be like overflow space. So at our 10 o'clock hour, historically, post-COVID, we've run a venue, but in the earlier iteration, we leaned into live worship and only video teaching. We would stream the teaching in there. And, we'd put 50 to 60 people up there maybe. And those were some folks that we could either pull off of the 10 o'clock hour, or when it got capacity, we had still a place for them. We've moved that now to a full-on streamed experience. So we put a big LED video wall in there so that we could kind of capture as best we could the worship experience downstairs. And it's streamed from start to finish. And what that's allowed us to do is take some of the pressure off of our worship team, so they're not having to program schedule 2 separate teams. But it's also given us the opportunity to add multiple services up there as we need to, with minimal manpower requirements. We just need to put a volunteer team up there to be ushers and greeters, and we can expand that. So at our 11:30 hour, in those first few weeks in January, we could put another 100 plus people up there because we had to. We had nowhere else for them, and it was an easy spot. We're not going down the campus multi-site road. This was an intentional decision, particularly because the growth of our area was coming to us. Literally within a 10-minute radius, a new Costco just opened up half a mile down the road. There's new shopping complexes and housing developments within our 10-minute radius. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense for us. Modesto's, the area is about 250,000 people. You can get to the other side of town in 15 minutes. So we'd have to go outside of that. And the division of labor and attention and investment just wasn't going to make sense for us in that season. So
I would just say, Jeremy, it's really good just hearing and listening to how you guys are processing it. And Erin, I would ask you kind of the same question, because you alluded to, hey, we're kind of facing some of these issues. I would like to hear you talk for a minute about how you're thinking about it, because I think that's important for our listeners to hear how each of us are thinking about it if you're in this position. And so, but the big thing, the cautionary part for me is, as an older church leader, when we were faced with this dilemma in my church back in the 90s and early 2000s, when we went to solve it, now I reflect, we made it about the project and the idea and how pretty it might be. And it became, without meaning to, it became about the institution, like Jeremy talked about before. And I would say this: if you are in this position and you're creative with problem solving, how are you as a church leader going to attach the strategies you come with back to the Great Commission being a personal mission statement for every person in your church. And that activity, whether it's a capital campaign, generosity initiative, or the construction of a facility or multi-site, whatever the strategy is, that doesn't become the end, that we attach that to motivate, stimulate, inspire as a byproduct of people actually doing the Great Commission in their personal life. So, Erin, it's just my word of caution as a generational straddler right now. So, Erin, what I would say to you, I was asking you the same question. How are you thinking? How are you all in the team thinking about this right now?
Yeah, we're kind of on the front end of this conversation, I would say, but I think we've alluded to it throughout this conversation, but just like, how do we not pull people away? Like, my fear in building more buildings is that we pull people away from the thing that's most important, which we have said all along is not the church campus or facility. It's making disciples who make disciples who make disciples. It's living the Great Commission, right? And so any talk we're going to do about upgrading our campus or anything like that, we just started like kind of bringing our staff on board with this conversation of like, this all has to be tied back to who we're becoming, and we cannot lose that. And so if we hope that people are going to make disciples and live the Great Commission in their lives, they need a place to show up to learn how to do that. And so that's how we're kind of making that, like, our campus exists as almost like, I've heard our lead pastor say, like a converter, like from what people thought they were looking for into disciple makers. That's the purpose, like a training ground. And so keeping that vision in front of us. And then also I would say getting creative with, I think we have learned to rely on our campus and facilities because we have them. I think church planners could speak a lot into this. Like, how do you get creative when you don't have a permanent space? You know, church planners often have a space that they can use for a few hours on a Sunday. And the rest of the time, they're figuring out how to mobilize people to use their homes and to engage their communities and to meet at Denny's and to utilize the park and things like that.
Denny's.
So, hey, we have a men's group that still meets at Denny's. You know, hey, their French toast is pretty good. That's all I'm saying. So
they got some great omelets.
That's right. But I'm just saying again, if we're going to communicate to people that the campus is not the most important thing and buildings, you know, the project is not the most important thing, we have to live that way. And so the way we live that way is by reminding people there is more to following Jesus that can exist beyond this place. And so inviting people to be creative and think well about that, and pushing people and training people to do that. So that's how I would answer your question.
That's great. There's such a tension there, and you hit it, Erin, as far as like, you want your church and your campus to be a place where people want to invite their friends, but you also don't want them to hang out here. You want them to leave. Like, go,
yeah,
go
it's
out.
real. Yeah.
So
how do they like it, but not like it too much?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, it's real. Well, Jeremy, thanks so much for just inviting us into the journey your church has been on. And as Doug said, like, wow, what a celebration. God is clearly just multiplying effort there. It's just pretty awesome. We always like to offer a few practical tidbits to our listeners here at the end. And this conversation is so squishy because every single listener is in a different scenario in terms of their physical space, their community that they're in, what they're looking or needing to do. But I still think you hit on some things that are important. And one of the things you said early on was, we were planning for double impact, and I wish I would have actually planned for double impact. It's kind of, I'm using my own words, but that's kind of how you said it, right?
That's 100%. Yeah.
So what practical advice would you give to our listeners, no matter where they are, in terms of the conversation of physical space, what their needs are or might be? Like, what would you encourage our listeners to be thinking about now?
Well, I guess one thing I would say would be, like, actually map it out. Like, what would it look like for you to have, for us, if to have 2,600 people come through on a weekend? Like, where would we put them? How many seats would we need? What kind of space would we need in children's ministry? Where would they park? How many services are we doing? Like, actually do the physical work of the numbers, even just to inform and give you some context, or even just raise the alarm of, holy cow, we have significantly less space than we need, and we need to start these conversations earlier.
Yeah.
That would be one thing. The other part, like just from a full-on practical perspective, is don't be afraid to knock down walls. Literally. Like we have, I'll tell you one quick story. We had this great nursing mother's room that was vibed out. It was a nice quiet corner where moms could go. The service was streamed in there. I would be known during the week to go take a power nap in there. Like it was a sweet, vibey hangout spot. But what we found was moms were setting up shop in there. They would go in, they'd nurse their baby, and they'd hang out. And we were needing more space for babies, for littles. So finally, we literally tore a wall down, expanded our baby's room, which meant we lost our nursing mom's room. Now we have a nursing mother's corner where it's in another room with kids. There's a divider set up so they can still have some privacy, but it's not the vibey hangout spot it was previous. And we're okay with that because we need them to do their thing and get out. There's probably another mom behind them, and we needed that vibe spot for growth in the immediate. So that's one story of how we're trying to, with what we currently have, make room.
Yeah, that's so good. I appreciate that. I think your first point is so important. Like, have we actually turned our philosophical hopes and dreams of how we hope our church grows and like done the math to see what does that actually look like? How does that actually go on a weekend? And the discipline to do that while time consuming is worth it because these conversations don't go quickly. Building buildings doesn't happen overnight. And so I just want to add a word of caution to, it's good to exercise all the other ways that we need to think well about something before we just conclude that building buildings is the next thing we need to do. That might be what we need to do. And also we should do the hard work of looking at the way we're thinking about programs, the way we're thinking about how people utilize space, the way we're thinking about what needs to happen on our campus and what doesn't need to happen on our campus. All of that discernment work should be done before we commit to building any more buildings. So I just want to offer that.
Amen.
Yeah, that's a great word. And we did that, and we're still doing that, especially now as we're trying to handle this growth in the immediate, right? Like, what can we do? Do we really? For us, it's the last resort.
Sure.
Building and committing to the campaign and all of that. That's a last resort, which is exciting.
Sure. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for just inviting us into your church's journey. For letting Doug say your name wrong, giving him grace, and
raising a Golden Knights fan.
Yeah,
right.
For
all the perspective that you have offered us, and to our listeners, I hope that just wherever you find yourself in terms of physical space and the needs that you might have in that arena, that you would just think about some of the things that Jeremy has offered from his perspective. But yeah, Doug, thank you. Jeremy, thank you. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning into the Intentional Churches podcast, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thanks, guys.